The gravy hadn't even hit the mashed potatoes when I heard the thud, a sharp, awful sound that cut through the laughter and silverware clinks like a scream in a church. I looked up just in time to see my 6-year-old daughter Maxie slumped sideways against the antique buffet, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open, a thin trail of blood beginning to form at the corner of her lip. My breath caught in my throat as I rushed to her, the chair behind me screeching across the hardwood, my legs moving before my brain could catch up. What happened? What happened? I kept repeating it, my voice shaking as I scooped her up. Maxie's small hands clung to my shoulder. He pushed me, Mommy. Her voice was barely more than a breath. I turned my head, and there he stood. Franklin Wallace, my ex-father-in-law, rigid expression flat, one hand still slightly raised like he was brushing off a stain. She ran at me, he said flatly. I warned her not to. I blinked, stunned, then looked around the table. Karen, his wife, gasped softly but didn't move. My brother-in-law cleared his throat but said nothing. My sister-in-law looked at the floor. Not a single person stood up. Not a single person defended my child. Franklin had just shoved a 6-year-old girl into furniture, and no one said a word. My heart was pounding, my daughter shaking in my arms, the metallic scent of her blood creeping into my nose. Franklin, I said his name like it was poison. What is wrong with you? He didn't even blink. She could have broken something valuable. That's what he said. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I didn't mean to. Just a complaint about property. Jenna. Karen's voice was soft and pleading. It's Thanksgiving. Can we just calm down? No. No, we can't. I grabbed my purse with one hand and Maxie with the other. We're leaving. No one stopped me. Not even Karen. No one followed us out. The house was quiet behind me eerily, so like they all agreed silence would fix it. Outside, the wind was sharp, slicing through my sweater as I strapped Maxie into her seat. I dabbed at her lip with a tissue and looked for other bruises. She flinched when I touched her arm. I'll take you to the hospital. I said it quietly, trying to sound calm, but inside I was screaming. As I closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, Maxie looked at me through the window. Her eyes were big and wet, but steady. Mommy, this isn't the first time Grandpa pushed me. My hands froze on the door handle. My lungs stopped working for a moment. That one sentence undid every excuse I had made, every moment I'd brushed off his coldness as old age or grumpiness. We weren't going home. We were going to the hospital, and this time I was going to make sure the whole truth came out. The emergency room was cold fluorescent and crowded, but none of that registered. I sat in the corner with Maxie curled against me, wrapped in a scratchy hospital blanket, her tiny body limp from exhaustion. Her lip had been cleaned and bandaged, her head examined, but the real damage, the invisible kind, loomed darker than anything a scan could reveal. When the pediatric nurse came back with the X-ray results, her voice was gentle but firm. There's a hairline fracture in her forearm. It looks like it's healing but wasn't treated. My brain stalled trying to process her words. Healing. Not fresh? I don't understand. When could this have happened? The nurse paused, weighing her tone. We asked Maxie. She says her grandfather grabbed her hard last month when she spilled juice on his rug. Said he squeezed her arm and told her not to cry or he'd take her tablet away. That's when the room tilted for me. I felt dizzy, as if someone had turned off gravity. The doctor joined us, explaining the fracture had started healing naturally, likely from several weeks ago. No ER visit, no cast, no painkillers, just a 6-year-old enduring it in silence. They were obligated to notify Child Protective Services. The words hit me like a slap. I nodded, mute rage and shame twisting inside my stomach like a storm. All I could see was my daughter's face that night, curled on her side in bed, saying her arm was sore because she'd bumped into the table. I'd believed her. I hadn't asked more. I'd missed it. I'd failed her. That's the cost of doubt in a toxic family. You train yourself to question your instincts because the alternative is too heavy to hold. And Franklin had always been too heavy. From the moment I married into the Wallace family, he'd exerted his presence like a pressure system. Dominant, demanding, impossible to satisfy. He made his opinions known with arched brows, pursed lips, and sharp-edged comments disguised as concern. When I overcooked the turkey my first married Thanksgiving, he told the whole table, "This is why we have chefs." When I forgot his birthday one year while caring for Maxie with the flu, he said, "Some women just aren't cut out for both motherhood and marriage." But the most cutting part was that everyone else just laughed, brushed it off, or stayed quiet. Silence was the Wallace family motto. Don't embarrass the patriarch. Don't poke the bear. And I had played along until now. This wasn't about burnt food or bruised egos anymore. This was my child. A child who had quietly absorbed threats, physical pain, emotional tension. I asked Maxie again gently while we waited for the CPS rep, "Baby, why didn't you tell me he hurt you?" She looked at her lap, fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. "I thought if I was good he'd stop. And if I told you you'd get sad." That one sentence gutted me. My daughter had been protecting me from the pain she shouldn't have had to carry. I had stayed silent for her thinking it was the safest path. And she had stayed silent for me. But now I was done. The cost of silence was written all over her little arms and that bandaged lip. When CPS arrived, I gave them everything I could. The incident that night, the X-ray report Maxie's words. They asked questions. I answered through gritted teeth. I didn't care how the Wallaces would react. I didn't care if Karen cried, or if my sister-in-law unfollowed me, or if Franklin's lawyer called. The price of my peace was my daughter's safety, and that price had already been too high for too long. The nurse came back with a juice box for Maxie. She reached for it with her good arm, smiling up at the woman with the kind eyes. It was the first time I saw a glimpse of her usual spark that night, and it reminded me that I wasn't just fighting Franklin. I was fighting every moment I'd told myself to be quiet, every time I'd rationalized his cruelty. That fight was now, and this time I wasn't backing down. When I first met Franklin Wallace, I thought he was simply old-fashioned, a little stern, maybe even a product of his time. He was the kind of man who spoke in declarative sentences and never asked questions he didn't already have answers for. During our engagement dinner, he pulled my then-fiancé aside and asked if he was sure he wanted to marry a woman who taught 4th grade. Not that I don't respect teachers, he'd added, but let's be honest, Jenna's not exactly contributing to the Wallace legacy. I had laughed it off the way women are conditioned to do when men cloak cruelty and condescension. My ex-husband Daniel had said nothing, just sipped his wine. That silence in hindsight was my first warning. The Wallace family wasn't loud in their toxicity. They were quiet, polished, and well-dressed. Their brand of damage didn't scream, it whispered behind closed doors during phone calls laced with disappointment and side comments at dinner that landed like paper cuts. Franklin ran the family like a corporation. Everything had to serve the family image. Daniel, his golden child, was groomed from birth to follow orders to lead the company to marry well and produce an heir worthy of the Wallace name. And me, I was an inconvenience with a uterus. When I got pregnant unexpectedly, Franklin made a show of disappointment. It's too soon. Jenna needs to focus on fitting into this family before she tries to add to it. Karen had patted my hand and said, "He just wants what's best for his legacy." I nodded, swallowing shame like a bitter pill. After Maxie was born, Franklin rarely acknowledged her unless she was silent and perfectly dressed. If she cried, he scoffed. If she laughed too loud, he'd glare. When she started stuttering at age 4, he declared she was just seeking attention. "We'll fix that. She'll learn discipline in this family." But he never lifted a finger to help. He believed parenting was about control, not care. One afternoon when Maxie was 5, I caught Franklin gripping her by the wrist in the backyard after she picked a flower from his precious landscaping. She had tears in her eyes. I asked him what happened. He said she was being destructive and needed a firm hand. I didn't argue. I didn't want to start another fight. I just told Maxie to apologize. That night I cried in the shower, feeling like I had betrayed my own child. It happened again months later. This time he'd flicked her ear sharply for interrupting him at dinner. Daniel said nothing. Karen said, "Your father's strict, but he was raised that way. We all turned out fine." That's when I realized this wasn't just Franklin. This was generational, a family of ghosts wearing smiles. And I had married into it. After the divorce, I had hoped distance would protect Maxie, but Franklin's grip reached further than I imagined. Even after Daniel disappeared from parenting, Franklin remained in Maxie's life, demanding visits, insisting on holidays, treating her like an ornament to be polished or punished. I'd tried to set boundaries. I said Maxie was sensitive. I said we needed space. But the Wallace family treated boundaries like insults. Every limit I tried to set was met with guilt, subtle threats, or outright manipulation. Karen would call crying. Daniel's sister would text me paragraphs about family unity. And when I refused a summer trip once, Franklin emailed me directly. "You're damaging Maxie's legacy. A girl needs her grandfather." He meant she needed his version of him, the illusion. But illusions don't protect children from bruises, or threats, or the pressure to stay small and quiet to make grown men comfortable. I had believed that if I just kept the peace, if I just smiled enough, if I just stayed polite, I could shield Maxie from the worst of it. But peace built on silence is just a slower kind of war. And my daughter had been the casualty. What I didn't know, what I would later discover, was that Maxie had started keeping track. She couldn't name what was wrong, but she felt it. She drew pictures of our house where everyone's mouth was closed. She once told me her favorite animal was a turtle because they get to hide when people yell. That night in the ER, all of this came back to me in waves. The quiet insults, the subtle grabs, the way everyone tiptoed around Franklin like he was a bomb wired to detonate if faced with truth. And I thought no more. This isn't just about what happened tonight. This is about every single time I stayed silent when I should have screamed. Every time I called abuse strictness because I was too afraid of losing their approval. Maxie wasn't just hurt by Franklin's hands. She was hurt by my hesitation. That would never happen again. I looked down at her sleeping in my lap, her little fingers twitching in a dream. She had inherited a legacy all right, but I would be damned if it was one built on fear. The week following Thanksgiving passed in a blur of formal interviews, whispered phone calls, and mounting tension. Child Protective Services visited our home twice each time, asking Maxie variations of the same gentle questions, while I sat across the room gripping my knees to keep from trembling. Maxie answered calmly, honestly, sometimes too honestly. She told them about the time Grandpa Franklin grabbed her arm so hard it left red marks because she took a second cookie without asking. She talked about the time he called her useless for not knowing how to tie her shoes quickly enough. She even mentioned the day he told her mother was weak, that I wasn't cut out to raise someone with the Wallace name. I listened, heart clenched each word from her mouth, both validation and heartbreak. Franklin had been more than cruel, he'd been methodical. And no one stopped him. That realization was poison I drank every morning, and the bitterness only grew stronger with each phone call from the Wallace family. Karen left a voicemail that sounded like crying, but there were no actual tears in her voice. She said I was blowing things out of proportion, that Franklin was old, confused, frustrated, that I needed to think of the bigger picture. When I didn't respond, she sent an email. I saved it in a folder labeled Evidence. Daniel's sister Marcy sent a long, furious text that accused me of turning Maxie into a weapon. She said I was bitter about the divorce and using my daughter to punish a proud, misunderstood man. I screenshotted that too. The only silence was from Daniel himself, who hadn't called or shown up in over 4 months. Maxie didn't ask about him anymore, and in a way I was grateful. One less man to disappoint her. Meanwhile, Franklin didn't apologize. He didn't call. He didn't even acknowledge the hospital visit or the CPS involvement. But I saw his reaction anyway. He sent a formal letter through a lawyer requesting visitation rights under grandparent laws. The audacity made my vision go white. He was attacking now, using the legal system to reassert control. He'd always thrived on leverage and intimidation. But now I wasn't just Jenna, the accommodating ex-daughter-in-law. I was a mother ready for war. I contacted an attorney, a friend of a friend, a woman named Lisa, who had a reputation for handling high-conflict custody and abuse cases. She read the file I'd compiled, doctor's reports, CPS notes, voice messages, photos, and looked at me with a kind of furious resolve. "He doesn't know what's coming," she said. I nodded, but inside I was still shaking, not from fear of him, but from the depth of what had been allowed for so long. I kept thinking of Maxie's words in the car that night. This isn't the first time. And suddenly, all those little red flags I'd ignored snapped into a parade of alarms. like the summer barbecue when Maxie had refused to go near him claiming his hugs hurt, or her habit of asking permission before speaking when he was around, or how she clammed up entirely at Wallace family dinners, sitting stiff eyes darting for approval. It had always been there. I had just been too conditioned to notice. My entire upbringing had taught me to avoid conflict, to smooth things over, to be the peacemaker. But now I realized peace is not the absence of conflict, it's the presence of safety. And Maxie hadn't been safe. I had failed to protect her. I wouldn't fail again. Lisa advised me to start documenting everything going forward. Every interaction, every message, every second Maxie spent discussing her feelings or recalling memories. So I bought a journal and started recording everything she said, no matter how small. I kept a backup drive with copies of every file, every text, every piece of evidence. I wasn't just preparing for a legal fight, I was preparing for liberation. I knew the Wallaces would try to twist this to reframe the story to make me look unstable. But they couldn't erase the bruises. They couldn't silence Maxie's words. They couldn't stop the truth once it had been spoken. And truth, especially from the mouth of a child, is louder than any legacy. The next Sunday, Maxie asked if she had to see Grandpa again. I looked her in the eyes and said, "Never again, baby. Not on my watch." The court date came faster than I expected, a cold Monday morning draped in overcast skies and the kind of bone-deep stillness that makes you feel like something is about to go wrong. I sat in the waiting room of the family court building, clutching Maxie's stuffed rabbit in one hand and my case file in the other. My attorney Lisa sat beside me in a sharp navy suit, flipping through our documentation for the third time. Across the hallway, Franklin stood surrounded by his legal team, unbothered and composed in his tailored wool coat. Karen was there too, wrapped in a beige shawl like she was attending a church service instead of a legal hearing about her husband's abuse. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Maxie either, who was sitting quietly with a school counselor in the adjoining room coloring a picture of a treehouse. Franklin had refused all contact since the hospital report. No apology, no explanation. Just a formal request for grandparental visitation and a counterclaim that I was turning his granddaughter against him. His lawyer's argument rested on the idea that I was emotionally unstable since the divorce and using Maxie to lash out, that I was depriving Maxie of a critical familial bond out of spite. Lisa had warned me this was the angle they'd take, reframe my protection as vengeance. We walked into the courtroom and I held my breath, praying the judge would see through the show. Franklin's attorney opened with a calm, persuasive tone, listing his client's community service business history and reputation. He presented Franklin as a misunderstood patriarch, the kind who grew up in a different time and whose disciplinary methods were rooted in old-school values. Then they implied I was overreacting, unstable, possibly even manipulative. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I kept my expression still. Then Lisa stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't get dramatic. She just laid out the facts. Maxie's medical report, the timeline of injuries, the quotes from CPS, the voicemails from Karen, the emails, the photos, and then the journal. My careful, relentless documentation of everything Maxie had told me. Lisa read aloud from one entry. Grandpa said Mommy is weak. If I cry, I'll get weak too. Another grandpa told me girls who talk too much grow up to be nothing. Then she handed over the drawings, Maxie's little crayon pictures of houses where everyone had no mouths. A family photo where she had drawn herself with a broken arm. The judge's face shifted slowly with each piece of evidence. Franklin remained stoic, occasionally leaning toward his lawyer to whisper something, but his composure began to crack when Lisa played the audio clip, Karen's voice recorded during one of her tearful visits. He gets like this sometimes. He just gets mean when he's stressed. I know he grabbed her arm. I know. I'm sorry I didn't say something. I'm sorry. That recording changed everything. The room went quiet. Karen kept her eyes on the floor. I turned to look at Franklin, who was no longer smiling. The judge called a recess. During the break, I sat outside on a bench, my hands trembling. Maxie's counselor joined me, offering a cup of water. She said Maxie was doing okay, asked if she could show me the picture Maxie just drew. It was a simple scene, a mother and daughter sitting under a tree. Holding hands, a speech bubble that read, We're safe now. I bit my lip so hard to keep from crying that I tasted blood. That was the moment I knew the hearing didn't matter as much as I thought it did. Maxie knew. She knew I had finally chosen her over their approval. When the judge returned, she ruled in our favor. Full no-contact order against Franklin. Supervised visits only with other Wallace relatives pending a psychological evaluation. And an official report filed recommending CPS follow-up for long-term family risk assessment. Karen looked like she might faint. Franklin stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. As we left the courthouse, Lisa turned to me and said, "That was the moment he lost his grip. Not just legally, socially, personally. His silence was shattered, his image destroyed. And the best part, you didn't have to scream, you just told the truth." I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. But underneath that exhaustion was something sturdier, something that felt like resolve. Later that night, Maxie and I curled up on the couch wrapped in a blanket. She asked if we could make cupcakes the next day. Just us, no guests. I said yes, and she smiled. Not the tight, polite smile she wore at Wallace dinners. A real one, pure and unguarded. Then she whispered, "You used your loud voice. That's my favorite voice." I didn't cry then, but I would later when she fell asleep on my chest, her breathing steady and safe. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we had both finally come home. The court ruling should have ended it, but I underestimated just how deep Franklin's reach extended. Within 3 days of the judge's decision, I received 2 anonymous voicemails from blocked numbers, both laced with veiled threats. The first was a woman's voice, older, shaky, but deliberate. "You've embarrassed a good man. We remember things like that in this town." The second came late at night. "Keep your daughter away from the news. She doesn't need to grow up thinking her family are monsters." I didn't sleep that night. Lisa advised me to report both messages, and I did, but we both knew there wasn't much law enforcement would do unless something escalated. I changed the locks anyway. Maxie started sleeping in my room again, something she hadn't done since she was 4. I told myself it was temporary. I told her it was just because Mommy liked the extra cuddles. She knew better. She always does. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of the courtroom fallout reached further than I imagined. Franklin's local reputation began to fray. A quiet real estate deal he was pushing suddenly stalled. His book club stopped meeting at the Wallace estate. People who used to flock to him at country club events were now keeping polite distance. It didn't take long before the backlash turned inward. Marcy, his daughter, posted a vague status online about betrayal and manipulative women tearing families apart. She tagged no one, but everyone knew. Karen reached out again this time, not with a guilt trip, but a strange kind of pleading. She asked to meet for coffee. I said no. She then emailed me a letter handwritten, scanned, and attached. It rambled at first, circling through justifications and regrets. But one sentence stood out like a scream in a hymn. "I stayed married to a man I was afraid of, and I let that fear become tradition." That line haunted me. I read it 3 times, then printed it and added it to my file. I didn't reply. I didn't owe her anything. But it made one thing clear: I wasn't just fighting for Maxie. I was breaking a pattern. One that had existed in their family for generations. That knowledge didn't make things easier. Maxie's school began noticing changes. Her teacher emailed me to say Maxie was quieter, more withdrawn. She'd stopped volunteering to read aloud. She was coloring darker pictures. When asked what made her feel safe, she wrote my name. Just my name. I scheduled a child therapist immediately. The first session was quiet. Maxie barely spoke. The second, she cried halfway through. By the third, she finally told someone other than me about the time Franklin slammed a door in her face so hard it made her ears ring for hours. The therapist sent me an update that night. Maxie is showing symptoms of complex trauma, but she is responsive. She is processing. That single sentence kept me going for days. At the same time, I was fielding whispers in the community. Women I barely knew approached me at the grocery store, the library, even outside Maxie's school. Some offered quiet encouragement. Others shared stories, similar ones. A neighbor revealed her own daughter had stopped visiting her in-laws after a string of subtle but deeply damaging interactions with the family matriarch. Another mom admitted her uncle used to discipline her sons with a belt until one of them flinched in front of a teacher. I began to understand that my story wasn't unique. It was just rarely told. And in telling it openly plainly, I had cracked something open in the people around me. The price of that openness was high. But the alternative, the silence I'd lived with for years, had cost more than I'd ever measured. One night, as I tucked Maxie into bed, she asked a question that made me stop breathing. "Mommy, do you think Grandpa still hates me?" I looked at her, this small, brave child who had endured more than she ever should have, and I said the only true thing I could. "I don't know what he feels, but I know what we do. We love loudly now, no more quiet hurting." She nodded, then whispered, "Me too. I love loud." By early spring, I stopped waiting for peace to arrive and started building it myself. The emotional wreckage Franklin left in Maxie's world had settled into visible patterns, nightmares, flinching at sudden noises, an instinct to apologize for existing, but now we had tools to handle them. Her therapist, a soft-voiced woman named Dr. Morgan, began encouraging Maxie to draw her emotions. One day, Maxie came home with a drawing of a dragon locked in a glass box. Underneath, in shaky block letters, she wrote, "He can't breathe fire if no one opens the door." That image stuck with me. It was time I stopped playing defense. Up until then, I'd done everything by the book, documented, reported, testified. But now, I was ready to tell the truth on my own terms. I started by writing a blog post anonymous at first. I called it "The Silence We Inherit," and it was just the beginning. In it, I described what it feels like to watch a child shrink in the presence of someone they fear, how easy it is to excuse cruelty when it's wrapped in tradition, how often women are asked to endure instead of escape. I didn't name Franklin. I didn't need to. The response was overwhelming. Emails flooded in. Women in their 60s thanking me for voicing things they'd buried. Younger mothers asking how to spot red flags. Teachers sharing stories of kids who carried invisible bruises. The post was picked up by a local parenting site. Then a larger mental health platform. Within a month, it had been shared over 50,000 times. And that's when it happened. Someone from a regional news network reached out. They wanted to do a segment on generational trauma featuring my story. Lisa was cautious. Going public could invite backlash, she warned. But I was done hiding. I spoke in shadow for too long. Now it was time to stand in the light. The segment aired 2 weeks later. I didn't use Franklin's name, but I didn't sugarcoat what happened. The day it aired, my inbox exploded. But what I didn't expect was who called next. Karen. Her voice was different this time, less performative. Hollow. She said she watched the segment 3 times. She said she had been sleeping in the guest room for months, that Franklin hadn't spoken to her since the court ruling except to complain that I'd turned his legacy into a circus. She confessed something that made me sit down. He did the same to Daniel. When he was little, the belt, the locked closets, the bruises we explained away. I didn't stop it. I didn't even try. I wanted to scream, to ask why, to rage at her complicity, but all I said was, "I know." Because I did. I knew what generational silence looked like. I'd lived inside it, but I was the last door. This was where it stopped. In May, I launched a community initiative with Dr. Morgan and a few local counselors, the Stronghouse Project. It was a support group, advocacy hub, and educational resource all in one. We met weekly. We offered workshops. We gave people the language to name what they'd lived through. Maxie drew the logo, a small house with thick roots and big windows. When asked what it meant, she said, "It's a safe place you don't have to hide in." The first meeting, a woman in her 70s told us she had never spoken a word about what her grandfather did to her when she was a child. She cried in a room full of strangers, and no one looked away. Meanwhile, Franklin faded into the background. He stopped attending events. His photo came off the board at the country club. The Wallace name, once a badge of power, became a whisper people avoided. Daniel resurfaced briefly, sending a single text, "You made this a mess." I didn't reply. Let him live with that silence. He'd lived too long comfortably inside mine. One afternoon, Maxie came home with a handmade certificate from School Best Advocate. She'd helped another student report bullying to the principal. She told me it was because no one should have to wait until they're big to feel safe. That night, she asked if we could bake a cake, vanilla with blue frosting. When I asked what the occasion was, she grinned and said, "For loud love." I watched her stir the batter, her hands steady, her eyes clear. She hummed a song I didn't recognize, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I exhaled without fear. I had fought for her. I had fought for me. And now we were both learning how to live loud. Franklin Wallace's undoing didn't come in the form of a scandalous headline or a viral video. It came slowly, deliberately, like the tide eating away at a cliff. Piece by piece, his fortress of control began to crumble, and not from the outside but from within. After the local news segment aired, people who had once praised him with forced smiles began to look away when he entered a room. Karen, despite everything, finally filed for a legal separation. I heard through a friend that she'd moved in with her sister across town and started attending therapy for the first time in her life. The same week, the country club board quietly removed Franklin from its advisory committee, citing shifting values and expectations. I knew what that meant. The unspoken truth had taken root, and now it was growing. But the real collapse began when Franklin tried to take legal action again. He filed a defamation lawsuit against me, accusing me of orchestrating a public smear campaign. Lisa laughed when she received the papers. "He really thinks he can intimidate you into silence." But this time, we weren't playing defense. We countered with evidence, medical reports, CPS documentation, court transcripts, audio recordings. Lisa filed a motion to dismiss with a memorandum that read more like a dissertation on psychological abuse and the public interest of truth-telling. The judge threw it out within days. The message was clear. Franklin no longer had the power to bully his way through a system designed to protect people like Maxie. A week later, Maxie's school hosted a community open house. It was meant to be a simple gathering of students, families, and local organizations. The Strong House Project had a booth, and Maxie insisted on helping me set it up. She arranged pamphlets with care, placed her dragon drawing in the center of the table, and handed out stickers that read, "Loud love lives here." I watched her with awe. This child who had once flinched at every loud voice now stood tall, speaking to other kids about safe spaces and kind adults. But then I saw him. Franklin. Across the room near the snack table. Alone. No Karen. No entourage. Just a pale man in a pressed coat clutching a styrofoam cup of lemonade. I froze. Maxie didn't. She looked up, saw him, and turned back to me, her face calm. "He doesn't scare me anymore." My stomach twisted, but I trusted her. We stayed. We didn't hide. And Franklin. He left before the evening's speeches began. Not a single person stopped him on his way out. That was the beginning of his invisibility. Over the next month, more people came forward. An old employee of his real estate firm shared his own experience of verbal abuse. A former neighbor admitted he once saw Franklin yelling at Daniel in the backyard while holding a belt. No one called the police back then, but now in the aftermath, people were talking. And that talk was louder than Franklin had ever allowed. Then came the final blow. A regional parenting magazine published an article on intergenerational abuse and featured the Strong House Project prominently. Maxie's drawing, altered to remove her name, was used as the header image. The article didn't name Franklin, but it didn't have to. The pattern was unmistakable. That same week, his company's longtime legal advisor resigned. His accountant stopped returning his calls, and someone spray-painted a dragon on the wall outside his gated driveway. It wasn't graffiti. It was a message. "You can't breathe fire if no one opens the door." Maxie's words, her truth. Franklin had spent his entire life building an empire on silence, but now the silence was gone, and all that remained was the echo of what he'd done. One afternoon, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photo, an old one of Franklin holding Daniel as a baby standing in front of the family's first home. On the back, written in Karen's handwriting, were the words, "The legacy ends here." I stared at it for a long time. Not with sadness, with clarity, because that was exactly what we had done. We had ended it, not just the violence, but the myth. The idea that power meant fear, that age meant authority, that family meant unquestioned loyalty. We had rewritten the meaning of legacy. That night, Maxie and I sat outside under the porch light. She told me she wanted to write a book when she grew up, about dragons and glass boxes and how to fight quiet monsters. I told her I'd help her publish it. She leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Maybe I'll put Grandpa in the book, but not as a villain, just as a warning." I didn't say anything. I just wrapped my arm around her and listened to the sound of her breath, steady, unafraid, free. 6 months after the court hearing, the house finally felt like a home. Not just a place where we slept and ate and tiptoed around tension, but a space filled with laughter, loud music on weekend mornings, and walls that no longer absorbed fear. The bruises on Maxie's arm had faded long ago, but the healing that mattered most happened in smaller, quieter ways. She started singing in the car again, her favorite being a song about stars dancing at night. She wore bright colors without asking if they were too loud. She didn't flinch when someone knocked on the door. And every night before bed, she'd place her stuffed rabbit next to mine on the couch and whisper, "Safe spot," like it was a spell. It worked every time. I had begun to change too, though I didn't notice it at first. It came in subtle shifts, speaking up when someone interrupted me saying no without apology, correcting people when they assumed I was fragile. Lisa had suggested therapy for me as well, and I reluctantly agreed. My therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Lee, wasted no time in peeling back my layers. She said something in our second session that stuck with me. "You were trained to believe silence was strength, but silence is just control in a different outfit." I nodded through tears. Because it was true. I had been taught that being polite, patient, forgiving, especially with family, was the highest virtue, but all it had done was hand power to those who didn't deserve it. Reclaiming my voice wasn't about yelling louder. It was about choosing when to speak and when to walk away, and never confusing peace with permission again. Maxie's school counselor sent a note home one day saying she had volunteered to help a new student who'd recently lost a parent. She sat with him at lunch and drew a picture of two people under a rainbow umbrella. "You're not alone" was written across the top. I stared at it for a long time. Not because I was surprised, but because I knew that was her way of becoming more than what had happened to her. She wasn't just surviving, she was building. And so was I. The Stronghouse project continued to grow. We secured a small grant and began offering free legal consultations to women navigating custody battles or protection orders. I led a workshop called "When the Hurt is in the Family," and 30 people showed up. 30 stories, 30 patterns, 30 brave interruptions. At the end of one session, a woman hugged me and whispered, "You helped me believe my daughter's voice mattered." I walked to my car that night and cried. Not because I was sad, because I finally understood the impact of refusing to stay silent. Franklin was no longer mentioned in our house. Not because we were pretending he didn't exist, but because he no longer held the power to shape who we were. We didn't erase him. We simply outgrew him. One evening, Maxie and I were reading a book together when she turned to me and asked, "Do you think I'll still remember him when I'm big?" I thought for a moment and answered, "You might, but not like before. You'll remember what you learned, and that's enough." She nodded, content. Then said, "I think I'm going to write that book after all, about the glass box and the dragon, and about how sometimes the bravest thing is to open the door and walk away." I kissed her forehead. "You already started writing it, sweetheart. Every day you wake up and choose love over fear. That's another page." That night as she slept, I opened my laptop and began to write again. Not a blog post, not an essay, just words. Words about healing, about breaking cycles, about the strength in quiet resistance. And as the page filled, I realized something I hadn't dared to believe before. My voice, the one I'd buried under years of shame and silence, was finally mine again, and I was ready to use it. It happened one Sunday afternoon as Maxie and I were folding laundry together. The windows were open, letting in the soft hum of spring, and she was humming a tune she'd made up herself, something light and off-key that made the room feel warmer. I handed her a shirt and she held it up, squinting at it like it was a puzzle, then said casually, "Mommy, do you think Grandpa will ever say sorry?" I paused. The air stilled. Not from fear, not from pain, but from the weight of the question. I folded the towel in my hands, smoothed its corners, and said the truest thing I could. "I don't know. He might. Or he might not. But either way, we don't need it to move forward." Maxie nodded, thoughtful. I think if he does say sorry, I'd want to hear it. But if he doesn't, I'm still okay. I reached over and squeezed her hand. That's what healing is, sweetheart. Not waiting for someone to fix what they broke, but choosing not to carry it anymore. We finished the laundry in silence, and afterward she drew another picture, two people walking away from a burning house holding hands smiling. She titled it, "We're Better Now." That drawing went on the fridge, not as a symbol of trauma but of triumph. Because she wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. And I was too. Our lives began to stretch into something normal, even joyful. We had dance parties in the kitchen. We made up stories about magical forests where the animals wore suits and the villains were always too tired to fight. Maxie learned to ride her bike without training wheels, and I learned how to laugh without flinching. There were still hard days, triggers, bad dreams, guilt. But they came and went like storms, brief and tense, and then gone. What stayed was the strength we built together. One evening, while reviewing materials for an upcoming Stronghouse workshop, I found myself writing a new kind of letter. Not a journal entry, not an email, just a letter addressed to no one and everyone. In it, I wrote, "To the mothers who are afraid to name the pain in their families, you are not betraying anyone by protecting your child. You are not breaking anything that wasn't already cracked. You are stopping the cycle. You are building a new one." I shared it anonymously online. It was reposted thousands of times. One person commented, "This made me call my sister and apologize for not believing her." Another, "This is the reason I finally told my mom what our uncle did." And then one that simply said, "I read this and cried for the child I used to be." That's when I knew the story was never just mine or Maxie's. It belonged to everyone who had lived with quiet monsters and finally said enough. Franklin never apologized. I doubt he ever will. He still lives in the same house, walks the same paths, probably still tells himself the same story that he was misunderstood, that he meant well, that the world changed, and he didn't. But that story no longer defines us. Our story ends with truth, with safety, with loud love. And that's enough. Maxie once said bullies come in all shapes and sizes, even grandfather sizes. But so does bravery. It comes in the form of small girls standing tall, in mothers learning to speak, in communities choosing light over legacy. We stopped a cycle. We chose something better. We chose each other. And if there's one thing I want Maxie to remember, not just as my daughter, but as her own person, it's this: the bravest thing she ever did wasn't exposing the truth. It was believing that love, real love, doesn't hurt, doesn't control, doesn't silence. Love shows up. Love protects. Love listens. And when it has to, love walks away. This story began with a fall, Maxie on the floor, bleeding and confused. But it ends with us standing, together, strong and loud. For anyone still stuck inside a house of quiet hurting, this is your permission to leave, to speak, to begin again, because the door is always open, and what waits on the other side is not just healing, it's freedom.